We are back in the studio, Tom.
Yeah.
It's like coming home after a long vacation.
You didn't have a beard last time I saw you, Dave.
No, it's. I don't know that you had a beard the last time I saw you.
That might be right. That might be right.
I was thinking about this the other day. I mean, you and I, even before we started Vino Veritas Society, we've been doing work together for a long time.
Yeah.
This has been one of the longest periods. We saw each other this morning when we walked in.
Yep.
It's the first time I've seen you in probably 6 weeks.
Yeah.
It's been one of the longest periods we've gone.
You were down with COVID, and then and we did a good job. I mean, you stayed isolated, and we were doing our work remote and everything. And then I had some travels to the East Coast. That's very likely where I picked COVID up. And then I've been struggling. I think I struggled more with it than you did. So it turns out I've been reading to try to understand my illness better. There is something called long COVID, and some people have these problems that stretch on, and I seem to be in that category because I developed bronchitis with a little touch of pneumonia after the COVID had subsided. So the main symptoms, the fevers and all that had gone away.
Yeah.
But the stuff in my chest and in fact it's not all the way gone yet. I've been on antibiotics and doing all that kind of stuff. I'm getting closer to being 100%.
Yeah. Well, it's great to be back in the studio together. I think this is so much more fun when we can do it in person. There's also a whole conversation to have here that I don't want to get into today, and I don't know that we ever need to get into in a podcast, but you did say it. You probably had COVID worse than I did. I had about 4 or 5 days where I was lethargic and couldn't get out of bed, and I couldn't move, and I didn't eat for about 6 days.
Yeah.
But I never had the chest stuff. I never had the smell, the taste, the just downright. I mean, I had the fever, and I couldn't get out of bed.
And the other thing that I've noticed is still with me right now, the fatigue. Every day recently, I've been mid-afternoon, 2, 3 o'clock, I just tank, and I get in this state where I can barely keep my eyes open. And thankfully, I've been in situations where I've been able to sleep. But it's really been tough lately.
Well, so for all those politicians who keep telling us trust the science, you got both shots.
I did. Yeah, that's right.
I didn't.
That's right.
And you were at least just as sick as I was, if not more. So
yes.
I'm going to leave that for everybody to think about what they want. But I'm not saying COVID isn't real, and I'm not saying that COVID isn't devastating. And I have some real anger towards the people who created COVID.
I agree.
I think what they did and what they unleashed on the world is a horrific thing.
In fact, I'll add to that. There are this group of large numbers of people who are angry. They're vigilant. They're determined to force other people to, get vaccinated and do these things, whether they want to or not. And then you have this other group that's equally angry and pushing back and saying, "No way! Don't tell me what to do about the vaccine and everything." I wish all that attention and anger was aimed at figuring out who created this stuff? Right. Who actually did this? Who in particular is responsible? What role, if any, did Anthony Fauci have and all the bureaucratic minions at the NIH and the other organizations funneling money to research laboratories in hostile regimes doing gain-of-function research on viruses that has caused all this? I want to know. I want to know. I especially want to know if one penny of my money went to that, because I don't want to fund it. I don't want to fund gain-of-function research on viruses in hostile regimes. I don't want to do that.
Well, I think you and I both know some of your money went to funding that, and there are a few members of Congress who are pushing for that research, but not enough, and it's really a problem. And I still sit back and I watch how sick you were, and I've talked to quite a few people recently who got vaccinated and still got very, very, very sick.
Yeah.
And then I hear our politicians telling us, well, okay, now as long as you got the vaccine, no more masks. We don't need mandates anymore.
Right.
If you got the vaccine, you can go live your life and you can be in crowded public places as much as you want. And if you didn't get the vaccine, you better sit at home.
Right.
Don't do anything. You can't be a part of this world anymore. And I'm just sitting there saying, you're telling us trust the science? What science are you reading? Because the empirical evidence is telling me something completely different.
Yep.
A little rant over, but that is a problem that we have to address sooner than later in our communities.
Well, and I'll add on to this, and I know we're going to move on, and we've talked about this before. At the Vino Veritas Society, we place great importance on the classical understanding of prudence, practical wisdom, and what a challenge it is, everything that's required. And part of prudence is judging, evaluating competing goods and competing bad things, competing problems, and trying to figure out how much risk are you willing to take in a particular situation, right? What might be worth something? Those kinds of questions really are questions of personal judgment. That's not a question for science to answer. You know, how much risk is David Rich willing to take in this situation, in that situation, right? How much money is he willing to gamble? How much is he willing to jump out of an airplane with a parachute, right? Yeah. All these different scenarios, science can answer none of those questions. Right. Only David Rich can answer those questions.
I'm just going to leave it there because we could end up spending the whole hour on this, and there's no real reason. There's a couple other things I did want to talk about today, and before we get into anything really meaty, one of our goals with the podcast every week is to help people see what's going on around them in the world and be able to frame it in the context of the American idea.
Yes.
And to frame it in the context of the progressive idea and understand the progressive influence on things and understand the American idea influence on things and really be able to analyze that.
Right.
And there has been something that I've talked about ongoing through our podcasts for months. And those are the ads by Facebook that are airing on television, right? We've been talking about these ads, and I get worked up every time I see them. Half the time I change the channel. Half the time I want to throw a shoe at the TV. Yep. Luckily, I actually like my property enough that I'm not going to go do that. But Facebook has been running all these ads advocating for more regulation.
You bet.
For a year now.
Surely, Dave, they want more regulations because it's good for us. They really care about us, and they want to make sure that we're protected, right?
You'd think so, right? Especially in Zuckerberg's new metaverse. I don't know if everybody saw this. They changed the name of Facebook. Do you know this?
I don't think I know this.
As far as a corporate entity, Facebook is now a product under the parent umbrella company called Meta. And Mark Zuckerberg came out with a new thing that they're trying to build, what is called the metaverse.
Okay.
It's a virtual interactive. So Facebook bought Oculus a couple years ago, which are the virtual reality goggles and headphones and all of that. Now they're integrating that, and they are creating Facebook communities where you put on your Oculus headset and you can connect with friends in groups and things like that in these highly elaborately designed meeting spaces and actually meet in person virtually.
Okay.
It's sort of the bringing together of Facebook communities and Zoom and virtual reality into one place. If you ever saw the movie Ready Player One, it was sort of a targeted towards teenagers. But the idea is these haptic suits that you put on and you can live in this virtual world. And the world had just gone to total decay, and everybody was living in these tiny trailers all over, stacked on top of each other. So they lived in this metaverse. Now Mark Zuckerberg is trying to create that. And Nike actually jumped in this week by starting to create virtual shoes that you could buy in Facebook's metaverse.
Virtual shoes.
Virtual shoes.
What does one do with virtual shoes?
Put them on your virtual character.
What does one's virtual character look like?
Whatever you want it to.
Oh, of course.
But you have to use real world money to buy clothes, to buy shoes, to buy everything you want. Your character just starts as this plain person.
Right.
And if you want to dress them up, if you want to make them look certain ways, you have to buy products.
Gotcha.
The whole thing. So as Facebook is doing this, they're still advocating for more regulation. Well, we've talked about forever that Facebook is advocating for regulation because they want to really eliminate the competition.
That's
the more they can be in control of regulations, the harder it is to comply with those regulations, the more money it costs to comply with those regulations. And in order to do that, you have to have a bigger budget to launch a competitor to Facebook.
Yeah, let's make this as clear as can be. Facebook is advocating for more regulations because it is in Facebook's interest to have more regulations. And to anyone sitting at home scratching their head thinking, well, how can that be in their interest? Easy, because as there are more regulations, the burden, the cost of compliance gets higher and higher.
Right.
Somebody has to, if you're running a business, you have to hire people to go read through all the regulations, to submit all the forms, to put together all the data required to be in compliance. Facebook has no problem hiring teams, armies of people to be in compliance. Many big businesses have entire compliance departments right within. That's all they do. Who really gets pinched there? Small businesses. Small businesses don't have teams of bureaucrats and lawyers and accountants and experts to deal with all the compliance. And so it's small business that very often they'll just close because they can't keep up with the burdens of compliance.
It's the financially bootstrapped startup. That could eventually overtake Facebook. That person out there who can create the next thing, the better thing. Mark Zuckerberg knows that better than anybody because he did that to MySpace.
That's right.
Right? MySpace was out there and he says, I can do it better. Yep. And he started working on it. And the next thing you know, it came out and MySpace is long gone.
There's an interesting lesson there, especially with our audience within the Vino Veritas Society. We talk quite openly about free markets, economic freedom, competition, all these sort of concepts and related subjects. The truth is, citizens love competition. Economists who understand the conditions of human flourishing and prosperity, they love competition. Most business people do not. In this sense, many business owners, they don't actually want competition. No. They would love to destroy all their competitors by any means necessary. They'll tolerate competition, right, if they have to. But if there's some way to get rid of competition, absolutely, they're going to try to get rid of them. And one of the most effective tools is being provided by progressives, by the progressive regulatory state. Those regulations turn out to be a huge advantage for big crony corporations, and they're a huge burden for small startup businesses.
And the reason it becomes the advantage for the huge crony corporations is the crony corporations are the ones giving to the bureaucrats and funding the congressional campaigns and giving donations to campaigns, which in turn, those politicians and those bureaucrats ask those businesses, will you be a part of our focus groups as we write the new regulations?
That's right.
So at the end, everybody knows that Mark Zuckerberg or somebody from his team is going to be the one sitting in the room with regulators saying, this is what this regulation should say, and this is what this regulation should say.
Facebook, YouTube, Google will actually be in the room with the FCC talking about what the regulations should be, just like representatives from Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and Moderna actually sit in the room with the FDA, right? And talk about and of course, all these regulations are designed to benefit the big companies sitting there with seats at the table. The other thing that happens routinely is someone goes and works in a regulatory agency for 10, 15, 20 years, and then they get a job offer from Facebook, right? They've been working at the FCC. They know how the FCC works. They know the people, their friends. And so someone like a Facebook will hire those people because now they have an inside guy who knows the whole process, right? Regular small businesses, startup businesses, just don't have the resources to go hire ex-bureaucrats who used to work in all these regulatory agencies.
So the reason I brought this up is we've been seeing the commercials for about a year of Facebook regulations haven't been updated since the years of dial-up, and look how much the internet has changed. Shouldn't regulations have changed too? Yeah. And that's just been Facebook's sort of standard. They've had some people saying it. They've become a little more brazen recently. Their newest commercial is this cute young black woman. So she checks all the progressive boxes, who is sitting down for an interview. Right? It's as if the commercial is an interview.
Right.
And she says, I'm a part of Facebook's privacy team. And she's very proud. And she's talking about it as if all of the great things that Facebook cares about your privacy. Yeah. You have a Facebook account and we care about your privacy. And then the last 10 seconds of the commercial go from we care about your privacy to we want to make sure everyone else cares about your privacy just as much as we do, which is why we're advocating for new regulations around privacy. And I'm sitting there thinking, they're now outright telling everybody, if you can't afford to build the privacy,
to have a privacy team, right?
To have a privacy
She's part of the
team,
privacy team.
And I can guarantee you, the Facebook privacy team is PR people, is strategists, is web developers, is lawyers. I mean, we're not talking 3, 4, 5 people. We're talking 30, 40, 50, 80, maybe even 100 people on Facebook's privacy team. And they know that if they can get those regulations passed, that it requires 100 people on your privacy team, that anybody else who would ever want to start has to be able to afford a 100-person privacy team in order to just get started.
That's right.
Now think about that. We're not talking low-level employees.
Right.
You could pay what they say. What minimum wage should be $15 to $17 an hour.
Highly educated professionals there.
Probably an average of about $150,000 a year salary, and 100 of them.
Right.
You're now talking about $15 million a year in salaries just to pay a privacy team to keep you in compliance with the government, with the progressive bureaucracy, if you want to go in and start creating a competitor to Facebook.
It is a great example. It's a perfect example. Facebook already has that in place. They're a gigantic, successful, wealthy company. They can hire a big privacy team like that. Who gets hurt with all those regulations? It's the two guys sitting in their garage, right, writing some code, coming up with the next generation of social media platform that might be better than Facebook, might be more popular. It'll never go anywhere because they don't have $15 million a year to hire that team of people.
And the other people who get hurt are the consumer.
Yeah, you're right.
The consumer
Great point.
who gets stuck with all of that.
That's right.
There's one other thing I want to throw out on this.
I want to add, because that really should light some anger in some people. It means there are folks out there who might have some wonderful ideas for things that you, the listener, whoever listening to this podcast right now, there might be a new platform that someone could develop and they're not going to, simply because they can't afford the cost of complying with the government. And so you, the listener, never get to experience that. You never get to even make that choice. In the same realm, this becomes a matter of life and death. There might be someone out there who has an idea for a medicine or a medical technology that could cure your problem, whatever your disease is, whatever your ailment is. Someone might be able to cure it, but they look at that whole regulatory process and they say, it might take 15 years for the FDA to approve this, no guarantee that they will approve it. Before we can ever start to sell and get a return on our capital, we're going to send our capital in another direction. We're not going to invest in this. And so that new medicine, that new technology never gets invented. They don't even start because they just look at all of those costs and say, we'd rather go put our money somewhere else.
And I want people to think about all of that when they say, again, part of the goal of this podcast, the reason we do this is to help people think through these things so that when they're having conversations out in the public, they're prepared for the comments that they can make, the responses they're going to get, and how to respond in return, and how to have a quality conversation. The common responses, right? So if we go out and we say that, we say, I don't like Facebook. The common response from a leftist is to say, well, you believe in free markets. You shouldn't try to get Facebook taken down. You should go start a competitor. We need to start being better at going out and saying to them, it's that progressive government. It's electing AOC and Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer.
That's right.
And they're the ones preventing that from happening. It's not so easy to just go out. And part of that I hear from even people on our side all the time. I wish somebody would just go start another social networking site. It's not that easy. And we're looking at all of the problems with it. Parler is basically all but dead. at this point, right? Because Parler first started out, and then Amazon Web Services shut them down, and they had to find new ways of getting going.
Right.
And now look what we're seeing. The only person who's talking about a competitor right now is Trump.
Right.
Why? Because there's a ton of money.
Right.
And because he has other benefits of it. And this is not I'm not trying to take a shot at Republicans and Trump in this comment, but we talk about cronyism in everything. Look at the people who are being hired for this new Trump program, and it's just as crony. Devin Nunes, Congressman Devin Nunes, is being tapped as the new CEO of Trump's new social network. Why? Because Devin Nunes knows who all the bureaucrats are, who all the compliance people are.
That's right.
He knows who's going to be on in the group of regulators that end up writing these privacy regulations.
Yep.
And he can work his way into the room just like Mark Zuckerberg can work his way into the room.
In any area that is highly regulated, those who are cronies, those who are wealthy, those who are influenced, they always benefit the most. It's true in any business setting like what you're describing. It makes it really difficult for anyone else to come into that space and create a new platform, create a new business model. Think of the political realm itself, highly regulated, incredible regulations about who can give whom how much money, right? My friend Dinesh D'Souza actually went to federal prison because he gave too much of his own money to one of his best friends who was running for office. And it wasn't even much money. If I remember, I think he wrote out a check for $20,000. And in the world of national politics, this is someone running for a seat in the United States Senate. $20,000 is nothing, right? These campaigns run in the millions and millions of dollars. And so $20,000 is a little drop in the bucket. But he did in fact violate campaign finance regulations. He got punished, charged, and convicted of a felony, served time in a federal a prison. He went to prison because he gave his friend money. And so what happens when you regulate elections and campaign finance and all that? It discourages people with little money from running. Who does it incur? Who's incentivized to run? Wealthy people.
Wealthy people
with deep pockets who can fund their own campaigns.
Well, and it also prevents, if the little person does want to run, it's harder for them to get noticed and to get recognized.
Yes.
And so it gives this huge advantage to the incumbents.
That's right.
Go back and apply everything you just said to 1979. What if Henry Salvatore could not have cut that check to Ronald Reagan?
That's absolutely right. And this realm, I didn't plan on talking this much about this subject, but it has so many tentacles that reaches so far. Here in the news recently, probably most of our listeners saw that Bob Dole died, longtime United States Senator, presidential candidate, a prominent figure in the Republican Party, and a fellow Kansan. He was actually born and raised in Russell, Kansas, which is 25-30 miles down the road from my hometown of Hays, Kansas. And Bob Dole, of course, was a great war hero. Survived some just horrific, harrowing. There was one point when he was overseas where he basically buried himself under corpses and mud. Oof. And the enemy soldiers were walking by checking to see if anybody was alive, and they didn't detect him, and he escaped that. But like so many, he comes back, gets interested in politics, gets elected to high office, eventually serving a long time in the United States Senate. And the progressive environment that is all around him he becomes one of them. So among the things he did, he was the primary author of the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in the 1990s. And that law empowers a regulatory agency, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, to create all kinds of regulations for disabled people. So it'll tell businesses how wide your doorways have to be, where you have to have a wheelchair ramp or all these kinds of things. Now the old way was if a business said, I want to attract that business, so I'm going to build my own wheelchair ramp because I want people with wheelchairs. Then people with wheelchairs knew, oh, that's a place where I can get into. And someone else might say, I don't care if you come to my business. I'm not going to build. Well, okay, I'm in a wheelchair. I'm not going to go to that other business. This creates new regulations. And among the many perverse incentives that come from these regulations, it has launched an industry of corrupt people and lawyers who go around to little businesses, and they'll take photographs. If the toilet paper holder is 6 inches too high or 6 inches too low, it's not in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, they'll write a letter with that photograph and say, hey, you can either pay us $1,000 or we're going to file a complaint with the EEOC.
Right.
Or maybe their doorway, right, is half an inch too narrow. Take a picture of it, have your lawyer send it, and it's a shakedown. It's a shakedown. You either pay us $1,000 or $5,000, or you're going to deal with the federal government. And if you're a small business owner, you might very well consider, I'll just pay these guys their $1,000 and hopefully they go away, because I don't want to do. What business owner wants to deal with the federal government, right? Sending out bureaucrats and all of that. And so it gives rise to a shakedown industry of corruption and fraud and blackmail. How's that?
So on that note, I want to get into one other piece of news. There were a couple other things I wanted to talk about today, but I'm going to skip those, and I'm going to jump into what I think might be the most absurd thing I've seen all week.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of our members probably saw this. It made its rounds on the news after it happened. Masterclass.com, the online learning platform, which actually in the past I haven't agreed with all of the teachers they've had on there, but they've had some really good people. And
it certainly has appeared to be a serious platform, a serious institution.
Right. Well, they somehow built a class, and I haven't gone in to look at this in detail. I don't really care enough to.
Right.
But they somehow built a class that included Hillary Clinton sitting in her garden room in her home.
Teaching a class on how to lose an election?
That would have been more effective. Reading the speech that she had written that would have been her inauguration speech in 2016. So first of all, let's just talk about how...
Was it her victory speech, like right at the election, or would it have been her inauguration in early 2017?
I've actually heard both, so I don't know.
Okay, one of them.
And I don't care enough to go watch it.
Yeah.
But it talked about like the dreams of a little girl growing up to be the first female president, and every progressive comment you could think, and she cried through 90% of it, and she had to stop and wipe the tears away and everything else.
Right.
And it made it onto The View, and when the women on The View got a hold of it,
they loved it.
Oh my God, that was the most moving. And I'm so glad she read it, because it's going to inspire millions of young girls to think that they actually have a chance in this world, and all of these things. And now all of a sudden, Hillary has been everywhere this week. She's doing interviews, talking about that speech, and she's using it to start talking about our current state of politics.
Right.
And she's using it to comment on Donald Trump. She's using it to comment on Ron DeSantis. She's starting to wade in.
Yeah.
So in Vegas, you can bet on politics. Mm-hmm. They have odds on who do you think's going to win this election or that election.
And I think there are some websites too that track these things, and it's a very interesting indicator, because it's not about popularity, right? These are people. In some cases, they're actually betting their own money, so they're not putting money down on who they want to win.
Right.
They're they're investing, risking their own money on who they think is going to win, which is very, and of course, so those people are doing a lot of research. They want to win money.
And for those who don't know, and I don't want to spend too much time here, but how Vegas works, how lines and odds in Vegas work, is not trying to say we're going to try to figure out the score and give the line. Their goal is to spread bets across options, because the more diverse. So if you have a game, let's just talk a basketball game real quick. And they say, okay, this team is going to win by 10 points. It's not to say they actually think the team is going to win by 10 points. They're doing that to say, we think if we put the line at 10 points, 50% of the bettors will bet one way, 50% of the bettors will bet another way, and they have a fee if you lose, a 10% fee if you lose. So their goal is eliminate all risk. If 50% go bet one way and 50% bet the other way, their profit is the fee.
The fee, yep.
Okay? So It's the same thing. They want to spread their risk across the board, where they only want to pay out a small percentage of the person who wins on these bets, and then they make all their money on all the people who lose. Hillary Clinton, in several of these Vegas political betting situations, is now the favorite to be the Democratic candidate for president in 2024. Further, they are saying that the most likely presidential, the final matchup, the final matchup, is going to be Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump in a rematch of 2016. And what has Hillary been saying all week? If we let Donald Trump back in the White House in 2024, within 3 months, it will be the end of our democracy.
Oh, the end of democracy.
We're back to the end of our democracy. How many times did we hear that over the last 4 years of Trump's presidency?
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we actually think about what that means. Mm-hmm. We've spent some time. There's some videos on the website, some seminars and some videos on the website that talk about the progressive idea of the presidency, that really dig into what Woodrow Wilson and FDR, how they changed the idea of the presidency, and the importance of the presidency. And Hillary Clinton, as the dyed-in-the-wool progressive, she is into that hook, line, and sinker. She agrees completely that the president has to be the most important person in the country, and they have to have the most power, and everybody else should just do whatever they say.
Yeah. Well, so there's a lot to unpack there, Dave. Let's start with a few basic things. I can hear some of our members right now objecting. We're not a democracy. We're a republic. We're a constitutional republic, and that is certainly true in the literature of the American founding. They did distinguish a republic from some kind of direct democracy. The Greek origin, the word demos, from which we get democracy, it just means many, the many. So the rule of the demos, democracy, is the rule of the many. And the purest form of democracy is a mob. That's pure democracy. That is the many getting and going and doing whatever they want to do. Often it's, burning down someone's house or lynching somebody or some horrific act of it. Mobs tend toward irrationality and injustice. Mobs usually aren't very good at reasoning and achieving justice.
We saw a little bit of that last summer, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, quite a bit of it, in cities all across the country. And so the founders, because the founders made it very clear that a democratic tyranny, the tyranny of the majority, when the majority uses their superior power, their superior numbers, whether through votes or through physical force, as like a mob marching down the street, to go violate the rights of those in the minority, democratic tyranny is as unjust as a single tyrant.
Right.
Both are bad, both are serious problems. So they devise a constitutional republic that attempts to combine two things. And on the one hand, it attempts to incorporate the consent of the governed. You need the consent of the governed, because no human being is authorized, no human being has any rightful authority to rule over others. So you need the consent of the governed. At the same time, our constitutional republic attempts to secure justice, to protect the individual rights of citizens, which is different than the will of the majority. Sometimes the majority wants to do very, very bad things. And in our constitutional design, it's interesting for people who think democracy is bad. And there are critics, there are conservative critics that say democracy is very problematic. Keep in mind that there are parts of our Constitution that are very undemocratic. I guess this is also important for those who think democracy is great. Right. For progressives who are out there saying, we love democracy. Well, the United States Constitution has some very undemocratic features. Among them, the United States Senate is very undemocratic. There are, approximately 37 or 38 million people who live in California, and in Wyoming, I believe there's 800,000 or 900,000. Huge disparity in population. And yet, both states get the same number of senators.
Sure.
In that sense, right, the residents of Wyoming are very overrepresented in the Senate, and citizens in California are very underrepresented.
That's been a big argument by progressives who want to get rid of the Electoral College.
Yes, absolutely. It's not democratic enough. And one of the things I always like to point out, well, if you want to get rid of the Electoral College because it's not democratic, then certainly you agree we should get rid of the judicial branch, because the entire Supreme Court, right, is we, the citizens, don't vote on any of the judges on the Supreme Court. They are nominated by a president and then confirmed by a Senate. We don't actually vote on them. So
nobody should ever give the left that idea. the last thing we need at this point is them to expand the Supreme Court and start letting us vote on who should be a judge.
I think if they were to be consistent, it would be to just abolish the judicial branch. And given how bad the judiciary has been over the last 75 years, I actually might be able to get behind that.
I don't think that would ever be the case. You know that they would look at it as, we figured out how to control elections and how to win elections.
Yep.
And we're going to get our people in there.
Well, and here's what's interesting, right? So when you look at the Constitution, if you're a progressive who is a big supporter of democracy, and you say, yeah, that Constitution does have some undemocratic features, and it does. There is an amendment process. You can amend the Constitution and you can change most of the institutional arrangements and designs. But then we have this other feature in the modern United States, the modern American way of life, that is thoroughly undemocratic, and it is the progressive regulatory administrative state. We now have, you were talking about the presidency, and I almost think it's more accurate to talk about the executive branch, because the executive branch now includes way, way more than just the president. The president's only one person, and in some respects, he's not very interesting. He's not even very powerful compared to the rest of the executive branch, which is now thousands of regulatory agencies which employ about 3 million unelected bureaucrats, many of whom have the power to issue regulations binding on us as citizens as if those regulations were law. And yet all of those bureaucrats, every one, was elected by nobody. And this is by design. This is how progressives design they really designed the bureaucracy to be kind of a mirror image of tenured faculty in progressive research universities, untouchable, right? That they're not there by the authority or the consent of the governed. They're there because of their expertise. And if you, the student, don't value or don't appreciate what your professors are saying, or that's because you're too stupid, you're too uneducated, you're not scientific enough.
Right.
Same thing in government. If you don't like what Anthony Fauci is doing, well, that's because you're too stupid and you don't understand science, right? He's the expert, which is precisely why progressives designed the regulatory state to be beyond the consent of the governed. The early progressives, they said, look, the mass of people, they're too stupid, they're too uneducated, they're too ignorant to even know who the best scientists are. And so we don't want the bureaucrats being elected by the ignorant many. We want the bureaucrats to be selected by fellow bureaucrats, by fellow scientists and experts.
It's interesting you bring that whole thing up, and I hadn't thought about this before we started this today. I thought about it wasn't a topic I thought we were going to go down, but we've talked in the past about comparing Joe Biden to FDR.
Yeah.
And obviously we weren't alive during FDR's presidency. I don't know that any of our members were alive during FDR's presidency.
Right.
But I think there's this debate of, is Joe Biden a moderate or is he really a progressive?
Right.
And a lot of the people on the left like to say, oh, he's a moderate. He's not as you guys are using progressive and you just trying to make him look like he's
that
evil.
Whole discussion really calls for some defining of some terms, what these terms actually mean.
It does, but when Joe Biden in the New York Times is talked about as the heir to FDR, I've noticed one way in particular that I don't think any of the progressive politicians in the last 50 to 60 years have really acted. And it harkens back to some of the things that Woodrow Wilson wrote about and spoke about regularly, and that is being that captain of the ship and directing it. Joe Biden, more than any president in my lifetime and that I've read about in the last, like I said, 50, 60 years, has looked at his job, and Kamala Harris has looked at her job as, we need to define what the role is in the future. Where do we need to go? What do we need to look like? They don't touch any of the things that are happening today. They're not out there. You don't see Joe Biden actively talking about, we have a 6 or 7% inflation issue right now.
Right.
How am I going to address that?
Right.
He's leaving that to the bureaucrats.
Right.
He's leaving that to his bureaucratic agencies, and he's out there talking about, well, what am I going to do about climate change in 10 years?
Right.
And Kamala Harris announced today, right? She was named the border czar, a year ago, 6 months ago. Her job was to solve the problem at the border. And she showed up yesterday for the first time in a long time for a press conference. Right. And a reporter asked her, we just talked to the president of Guatemala, and he says, you haven't spoken to him once. Right. We thought you were taking care of this border problem. And she says, I'm not here to talk about that today. I'm here to talk about my plan to get electric charging stations placed at gas stations all over the country.
Right.
So you have Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the two main people in the executive branch out there focused on, where are we going? What does that future look like?
Yep.
We've got 3 million bureaucrats behind us. They're going to run your lives.
Yep. We're
not going to fix anything. We're not even going to pay attention to it. And I think Americans, as many Americans say they're progressive, and you talked about we need to define some terms.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the reason you see their approval ratings so low. People don't want to hear when progressives have been saying the president's going to take care of you, Joe Biden, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, right?
Right.
He said, don't worry, the government's on its way to help.
Right.
He's not helping anybody. He's out there doing all of these other things and talking about what he's going to do in the future and where the country's going to go. And everybody's sitting around saying, my life has gotten significantly worse over the last year. Things have gotten more expensive. My business closed, all of these problems.
There was a president in recent modern history who spoke that way, but conditions were much better really because of his predecessors, and it was Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton, well, first of all, he had the advantage of a Republican Congress much of the time. So his progressivism was sort of kept in check to a large degree. He also got he got the booming economy that came after the Reagan era. So things were better. But in terms of his rhetoric, his speech, Clinton, for example, loved that image. He used to use this phrase all the time. We're building a bridge to the future, right? And he never really defined clearly what exactly the future was going to be, but it was very thematic within the progressive framework that the future is going to be better. It's going to be a better place. It's going to be something. If it's not exactly heaven on earth, it's going to be close to that. We're going to be in a more heavenly environment. And all of that, the way Biden talks, the way Clinton talked, I mean, it has roots in the very beginning of progressivism, especially that notion of the progressive leader, that the leader the leader embodies the desires, the wishes, the wants of all the people. And so the leader makes the concrete decisions for us to help us get to the future where we all want to be. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, that sounds so abstract. What exactly is the future that we all want? Yes, that's one of the frustrating things of reading through those early progressives. It was this very open-ended, vague language. What exactly is, and they never described, just like Karl Marx never described clearly what life after the universal global communist revolution, what really would it look like? He never described it. So American progressives never really described this progressive future. The implication is, it's always implied, It's just going to be better. Trust us. It's going to be better.
Well, because they're the scientific experts.
That's right.
They know what's best for us, and it's going to be better. They're figuring it out behind the closed doors with the other experts, and they'll let us know when they're ready to and when we're capable.
I'm going to read for our listeners just a little bit. I brought a little Woodrow Wilson with me. This is a very early essay he wrote titled The Political Scientist. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was helping to create this new discipline of academic political science. And the date of this essay is 1880. So this is still fairly early in his academic career. And one of the benefits of studying these early progressives, and by the way, we're going to be we're creating more content that's going to be on the website, really parsing out in detail the history and the political philosophy of the progressive movement. One of the benefits is those early progressives, they were the ones proposing something new, something different. They were the ones leveling deep, serious criticisms of the founding, of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence, of the institutional designs of the Constitution. And so the burden was on them to give a defense, to give a justification. Why are you guys doing this? Why are you proposing something brand new? Today, after 150 years of progressivism, right? Progressives are now kind of the new conservatives. They're trying to conserve and protect this big administrative progressive state they've built. There's a progressive journalist who just retired. Gosh, he had all kinds of problems with plagiarism and making up stories. Brian Williams. And
it's pretty bad that you just have to say plagiarism and it comes to
that's it, Brian Williams. And in his little farewell, I mean, it's very short. You can Google it. It's, I don't know, maybe 90 seconds or 2 minutes. It's very short. But he has these parting words. It's his last broadcast, and he's signing off from NBC News. And in there, he says, now he's a progressive guy. And he says, I am neither a progressive nor a conservative. I'm an institutionalist. And I believe in the institutions of America. And then he goes on and says he's really worried because there are people out there challenging the institutions. Some want to tear down some of the institutions. Now that includes some of us at the Vino Veritas Society. There's all kinds I'd love to get rid of the Department of Education, right? And start from there and move on. But he demonstrates how to be a conservative today to be a progressive like Brian Williams really is to be a conservative. He wants to conserve and protect this big, sprawling, progressive, bureaucratic, regulatory, administrative state. 150 years ago, the early progressives, they didn't have that advantage. So they're having to explain. And one of the critiques of Woodrow Wilson and the Charles Merriam and Frank Goodnow and all these academics who wanted to replace constitutional self-government with bureaucratic expertise. One of the early criticisms was, well, you guys don't believe in democracy. It just loosely, you don't believe in self-government. You want to impose government on the people. And so Woodrow Wilson answers that accusation of being undemocratic. And here's what he says. He says, I've been asked, do I distrust, this is Woodrow Wilson, do I distrust the democratic foundations of the government under which we live? Do I suspect the people of blindness and all their leaders of charlatanry, and do I hold up popular government to be laughed at as a farce? He says, by no means. I simply take the liberty of believing in democracy as I understand it. And then he goes on to redefine what democracy means in the new democratic view. He says the new progressive view rejects the average man and average training, ordinary people who get elected, for example. The new progressive view rejects the idea of constantly renewing the official personnel of the government from out of the general body of the people. Now he's saying progressivism rejects elections.
Yeah.
Elections really, that's not what he understands by democracy. He says the progressive view of democracy seeks to substitute the person whom we used to call the man of the people with the men of the schools. the trained, instructed, fitted men, the men who will study their duties and master the principles of their departments. So, right, so what he's saying here is the old version of, whether you call it democracy or Republican self-government, either way, it meant the people electing representatives to protect their rights and to serve their interests. And he's saying this new progressive view rejects that view of democracy, and it embraces a new view, which is the leaders, like Woodrow Wilson himself, they sense where the future is going, where we need to get as a people. And then we create these bureaus staffed with the men of the schools, right? Men who are fitted and trained, and they're not constantly renewed from out of the body politics, right? Anthony Fauci, and his face has become like synonymous, right? As the lifetime bureaucrat.
Yeah.
We don't want Anthony Fauci to serve 2 years or 4 years, right? And then be up for election and someone else challenge him, right? We want him to be appointed and then to serve in his department for 30, 40, 50 years. And we want millions of others just like Fauci. And Woodrow Wilson is saying that's the new progressive view of democracy. So when Hillary Clinton and her supporters say, oh, this is a threat to our democracy, one of the important things we need to do is ask the question, what do you mean by democracy?
Right.
Is the FDA democracy? Is the EPA democracy?
You just gave the playbook for a Republican president running against a Republican candidate for president running against any progressive. If it is like Vegas thinks it might be, if it is Trump versus Hillary, what if instead of all of the other things he says, what if he walks in and says, do you really believe in democracy, Hillary? And she says, yes. And he says, then why don't you get rid of all the unelected bureaucrats?
Bingo. Wouldn't that be great? Imagine a candidate, whether it's Donald Trump or anybody else, who can say, is democracy a bunch of unelected bureaucrats at the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, writing regulations that give a monopoly to Facebook on social media? Right. Is that democracy? That's not democracy. That's an oligarchy. That's tyranny. That's the opposite of democracy. Stand up, and for our friends, for members of the Vino Veritas Society who are uncomfortable with that word democracy, and there are good reasons to be uncomfortable with it, substitute the word self-government. I believe in people governing themselves, a self-governing population operating and living well through a constitutional republic, and it has no place for hordes, armies of unelected bureaucrats telling us how to run our businesses and educate our kids and what medicines we must or must not take.
In the end, it comes down to one word for me, and it's one of our precepts. It's trust.
That's right.
It comes down to trust. And the opportunity in all of these elections is you put it in front of that progressive.
Yeah.
Do you say we're a threat to our democracy? Do you really believe in democracy? Do you really believe? And if you do, does that mean you trust people?
That's right.
Because you have to trust people to elect. If you're going to let elected people run your lives, you have to trust those people.
That's right.
So if they say, I trust people, well, then why don't you trust every citizen to be self-governed?
That's right.
And if they say, well, we can't trust all of them, so you don't, so should they not be able to vote? I mean, we keep talking, and I've been saying this, and you've been saying this for since the very beginning of Vino Veritas Society, and we were even doing it before. If you ask progressives enough questions and you ask them the right questions, they tangle themselves in their own net.
That's right.
Their entire concept falls apart because it doesn't make any sense.
Democracy, however defined, democracy, the idea of people governing themselves. Democratic self-government is incompatible with unelected bureaucrats and regulations. It's incompatible. Mm-hmm. Democratic self-government, it rests upon a premise of trust. Citizens who trust each other and say, live however you want to live, elect who you want to elect, right? And that's how we're going to solve our problems or our differences is through elections. Bureaucratic regulatory control rests on deep suspicion and distrust. Mm-hmm. And we should pin that like a badge to progressives. If you are for regulations and bureaucracy, then you are saying you distrust the American people. You think they're too corrupt, they're too stupid, they're too incompetent to make their own choices, to raise their own children, to run their own businesses, that you need Anthony Fauci's, millions of them, to command and control the American people. Then just say it and be open.
Right. You believe that you have to protect Americans from themselves.
From themselves.
Because they are too incapable, they're too stupid to be able to take care of themselves.
And there again, think of the opportunity for a Republican candidate to stand there and say, you, Hillary, you think Americans need to be protected from each other and from themselves, and that's why you want all these bureaucrats. I, the Republican, I think Americans need to be protected from you and from the bureaucrats. That's the biggest threat to them right now.
And what's most important takeaway from that is that's also what our founders believed.
That's right.
And so for anybody who's sitting there and saying, I don't know how to defend what our founders did, and at the very core, the founders said, trust your fellow citizens, teach your fellow citizens to be self-governing, to be virtuous, and never, ever, ever trust the government.
That's right. In the famous words of Thomas Jefferson, he said, this is in the Kentucky Resolutions, he said, enough about how much we should trust those in government. How did he put it? Let's bind them down with the chains of the Constitution. The Constitution is meant to be a restraint, a control on those with political power, with government power, precisely because it's so tempting to abuse. It's why we should not trust those in government. We should put our trust in each other.
Let's bind them down with the chains of the Constitution. I think that should go on a Vino Veritas Society t-shirt at some point.
I think so.
Or a coffee mug.
I think so.
Maybe we'll talk about that again in the next couple of weeks. So until then, we will continue to keep unpacking these ideas. I think there's more to this conversation and more to, as we are now through the 2021 election cycle, heading into 2022, I think there's a lot that's going to start happening and a lot that we're going to start seeing as people start preparing for 2024, which... You believe almost 2024. But in that time, Vino Veritas Society is going to grow a lot, and we're going to do everything we can to continue to guard and protect the ideas, the American idea, and the ideas of our founders.
Nos somos custodes.
Until next time.
All right.